Thank you for
my
coming.
pleasure. Are you kidding me?
And I
Thank you
just
for
kind of want
doing
to, I
your
just want to
work.
kind of tell you just a kind of a little background. As I said, Jim and I, when I'm not teaching, we probably filmed the last year and a half on the border.
Wow.
And looking at refugees and children in cages and asylum seekers. And I got really a lot of different people and a lot of different angles. Cool sheriffs that were born in Mexico, humane people.
Of course.
And so I think what I'm trying to do, I do a lot of long interviews, and I think the world is the long interviews for the old professor that people sit around for an hour and a half. And I think the reason I was attracted to your work and found out about it, I've been listening to a lot of your music lately, but I like the idea of people that are able to transcend the border. And when I saw what you were doing on the border, I was really attracted to that stuff and listened a lot more to the music and want to understand people. So what I wanted to do, and you take this wherever you want to go, seriously, it's a rough outline, you can take it, but I want to start here. What do you think when you hear Donald Trump talk about bad hombres, drug dealers, rapists, freeloaders, murderers from Mexico, and him building a great, big, beautiful wall?
I got to be honest with you, and I'm going to get in trouble for it at some point in my life, but the first thing I thought is dumb to bridge and tunnel crowd. That's, in New York, we have the people who are let into the hip clubs and then the bridge and tunnel crowd, of which I eventually became. Mm-hmm. But I just thought it was such ignorant talk and stupid talk and kind of dumb. And I hate to say this because there's nothing, this is not Queens, but there's I thought just a really country bumpkin from Queens. Staten Island, you can say that too. Mm-hmm. Just kind of really, I couldn't take it seriously because I thought, who's going to listen to a knucklehead from Queens or Staten Island? Of course, there are beautiful people from Queens and Staten Island, which is what I keep saying, but I couldn't believe that it would catch anybody's imagination. I thought it was really ridiculous publicity stunt, and I didn't take it personally. I didn't take it personally because as a Hispanic living in the United States, I've actually experienced a lot of marginalization. Even in New York, even in liberal New York, I've experienced it. I'm really, it kind of began to take hold for me when he threw paper towels at Puerto Ricans. That was when I realized there was a really rank hatred of Hispanics. Mm-hmm. By the time there were shootings in El Paso based on his rhetoric, by the time there were children being separated from their parents and being held in concentration, by that time it was like, what in the world has given license to this level of stupidity and hatred? I mean, I don't understand that at all. Bad hombres, when I think bad hombres, I think about Wall Street executives. Mm-hmm. When I think about drug dealers, I think of pharmaceutical companies. When I think of rapists, I think of Harvey Weinstein. This is not an issue that's localized to the Latino population or the immigrant population. People are bad in so many different incantations. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So
yeah, absolutely.
The hatred that Donald Trump has shown my people it's unfathomable to me. Mm-hmm. It's unfathomable to me. And so when I first saw it, it just seemed like a fantasy when he first came out with this rhetoric.
Well, it seems to me every time he's not doing very well in the polls, he goes back to his base and they want to build that great, big, beautiful wall, and they go over the same things again and again. He's talking about building a wall in Colorado where there isn't the border there. I don't know what he's talking about there. And they're trying to show in Arizona where they cut down some of these great, fantastic cacti, and they're starting to put a little bit of a fence out there so he can sell his base. Yes, we are building this great, big, beautiful wall.
There's ecosystems that will suffer greatly if they actually build the wall. I mean, there's entire floral and fauna that will have a very, very detrimental effect if they do this. It's you know what, the truth over history. Here's the thing that makes me nuts, is the truth over thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years of recorded human history is that walls are meaningless. They do nothing to stop any kind of political or strategical advance. They just don't. And we have like mounds and mounds of evidence that illegal immigration here is usually visa overstays. The drugs get in, fentanyl gets in from China through the airports. It's such an antiquated and again just intellectually bereft solution, and so anti-intellect and so anti-progress and so anti-humanity that it really if you told me this was going to be the case 10, 15 years ago, I would have laughed at you. I would have said that's just ludicrous. This is never going to happen in this nation. I really is super shocked that this is where we're at.
Right. Talk to me a little bit about the Fandango at the wall. A little bit about the origins, where this idea comes from, what a Fandango is, and when you see all the musicians that you had, I believe there were 60 on your album, incredibly eclectic musicians. So what's the origin? Where does that come from?
I have a whole nonprofit. I have a beautiful nonprofit. We do terrific work in performance and touring, recording, and education and consciousness raising. It's really a politically and socially active organization that does incredible good in New York. And one of my board members sent me an article in the New York Times about Jorge Francisco Castillo, who is a retired librarian who was volunteering his time cleaning debris at the border in Tijuana, and right at where the border wall literally juts into the ocean. And he's also an amateur musician, or he was an amateur musician. And he looked at the wall and thought it would be a great place to have a fandango, which is kind of the original meaning of that word is a dance. There was a fandango, a dance called the fandango. But over the time, it became a very important kind of catch-all phrase in Veracruz for any kind of get-together where people sing and dance and improvise.
Is that where son jarocho, that term comes from, that somebody has to come from Veracruz?
Yeah, son jarochero is a person from Veracruz. A haranero is a person who plays that music. And son is a kind of music that is very typical in Latin America. Son jarocho means a son from that region. And the celebration of that song is called the Fandango. So Jorge, he decided that he would have these jam sessions right at the wall, and when you first read about it, you don't quite understand it. You can't really understand it, by the way, just knowing about it. You have to kind of see this thing. You have to see human beings celebrating right at the site of this monstrous barbarity. And in their song and in their dance and in the words and proclamations that they make, they literally destroy physical matter. They literally, the wall stays, it doesn't disappear, obviously, but it becomes completely, instead of a tool that is used to divide and bring hatred, it becomes a tool. I don't think people realize that wall becomes a tool for unification.
So there's a certain paradox here. There's a contradiction. You're looking at a place that's supposed to divide people.
Oh, yeah.
And in essence, it brings people together. You spoke about a little mesh where people have the little pinky.
That's the Fandango Doctrine. We call it the Fandango Doctrine because what happens is that you go up to the mesh and the person on the other side can only see you through this little fine wire. And it's so fine that you can barely touch fingertips. And so complete strangers will go up to the wall and touch fingertips. And it's probably more human contact than they will have with that person. They won't have that human contact on the subway. They won't have it sitting in their cars in traffic. So like in some ways, in some very substantial, real way, all of a sudden you have human beings touching the tips of their fingers and they probably would never have physical contact with one another. There's also places where the wall is a little bit bigger and the perfect stranger will hand you a bottle of water. It's one of those things where the wall itself became the biggest source of freedom and liberation and spiritual emancipation that one could imagine.
Yeah.
And I found that when I read about it, I literally started crying. I read about it and started crying and thought, my God, this is the most elegant political activism that I've ever heard of in my life.
Did you tell a story of two brothers that actually could not see each other, that were playing music on opposite sides of the border?
There's actually a scene in our movie where one of the Villalobos brothers, who was supposed to be on the Tijuana side, could not leave the United States because he wouldn't have been able to return. So we have one Villalobos brother on the Mexican side and one on the U.S. side who were supposed to be playing in the same side. And they couldn't. But that's not even really the issue. The issue is that there are generations of family members who literally the only contact that they have with each other musically is through the wall. And that's, I mean, it's kind of devastating to watch. And really people, and you know what originally happened was that the border guards would open the wall periodically, would open the door on the American side to let Mexican Americans join together at the mesh with family they hadn't seen in decades. That's kind of the beginning of how this whole thing, because Friendship Park in San Diego is this, I think it's 40 feet section of space between the literal walls. And the border guards will occasionally open that part of the border so that people come right up to the wall. People have gotten married there. People have celebrated all kinds of life's rituals just by coming together.
Even have teeter-totters there now, so people on both sides of the border.
I saw the teeter-totter. I've seen the wonderful performance by Yo-Yo Ma at the wall.
Yeah,
an interactive celebration by I forget what Philharmonic, or it was a percussion ensemble. Yeah, but people are getting hip to the idea that the wall is really a symbol of nothing more than man's infutility, his inability to create true division.
Talk a little bit about the people that were assembled musically. I know you had people from all over the world, and I believe there were 60 musicians and 30 tracks. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But what kind of atmosphere and what kind of people helped you put that together?
Well, the idea for me was also about showing that the wall was symptomatic of much bigger walls. One of the walls that I rail against is the elitism wall. The idea that classical is this and folk music is that and jazz music is this, and so I brought together like a really diverse group of musicians. We have an incredible cast, the Afro-Latin Jazz Orchestra, which is the orchestra I founded. We have a wonderful oud player from Iran, Rahim Al-Haj. Oh, he's Iraqi. And from Iran, we have Saba Motalevi, a tar player. We have MacArthur Fellow Regina Carter, who's one of the most beloved jazz violinists in the world. We have a Golden Globe nominee and world-class drummer Antonio Sanchez. We have literally the Villalobos brothers. We have a cast of dozens of guest musicians from both sides. We also have Son Jarocho greats, Ramon Hidalgo, Jorge Francisco Castillo, just an amazing eclectic group of people that came together. And the thing that I wanted to do, the thing that really meant a lot to me, was that we would not impose. One of the things that I hate is when jazz musicians come somewhere and go, look how great we do what we do. We're jazz musicians. We're going to swing and teach you guys about this. And it's really a nonsensical approach to this kind of cultural diplomacy. My goal in all the cultural diplomacy that I do is to have our musicians go to different cultures and say, you guys are amazing. We just want to bask in your presence and maybe find ways to interact together. And that is something that I think that that did happen. Because the respect that I have for these musicians and the work that they do is profound. I find their music as complex and compelling and as difficult as anything I've ever played in a jazz or classical setting. And so we brought ourselves together at the Mesh with literally a sound engineer, with a multi-track digital recording facility, with mixing board, I mean everything. A film crew. We brought like 3 or 4 enablers, producers, people, stage managers. We brought 20 or 30 associate people, producers, friends, family. We literally brought a small army of people to the border of Mexico and the United States to proclaim this moment. And not to, and it was very funny because at first, Jorge Francisco Castillo was very protective of this thing. He said, we don't want to have a lot of...
Like proprietary? Is that what
No,
you mean?
not proprietary. Protective. He didn't want to make it a spectacle. It was a beautiful and solemn celebration of life. And he didn't want to make it about... Because they've had celebrities come, and of course, wherever celebrities come, there's cameras and there's all kinds of attention, but it takes the onus off the beauty of this incredible activism.
Kind of a purity that...
Yeah. Plus, the music is so bad. The music is so killing that you don't want to take attention off of that music. Mm-hmm. You don't want to intrude on that music. You don't want to intrude on that value system. You want to bring attention to the incredible soulfulness and musicality of these brilliant musicians. So in a way, the music of Son Jarocho is so beautiful to me and so profound that I also don't want to impose on it or intrude on it. And of course, Jorge and his people understood that. And so it took a minute, took a couple of visits to say, we don't want to take any attention away from this. It's really something we want to be, we want to stand alongside you and celebrate this thing. And that was the spirit. And that's the spirit I do a lot of cultural diplomacy work. I've been to the Middle East, I've been to Cuba, and every time I go with the intent of saying, you guys are incredible. Teach us.
I find it amazing, but I've done a lot of work in the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Wow. And I've interviewed, a lot of these people like Noam Chomsky.
Of course.
Norman Finkelstein. I was just recently in London last year with the guy, Neve Gordon. It was great. It was interesting to me that these are all Jewish people that I've interviewed that are called self-hating Jews and anti-Semites.
Of course.
And you see all this conflict. I've seen musicians come together, Israelis,
of course,
and Palestinians that are able to transcend the occupation, the conflict. There's something like on a higher plane.
There's an orchestra. I think it's I forget the gentleman who founded it, but it's comprised of Palestinian and Israeli musicians, and they play at the at the border, at the wall there. And this is important stuff.
Yeah.
In fact, the more we spend time in this administration, the more I realize that that's just noise. That there's noise with repercussions, obviously, but it's such an obvious ploy. And the really important work of bringing human beings together is a lot more powerful than anything that you can see on CNN or Fox. You know what I mean? It's like sometimes I feel like pointing out that so much of what has happened was created by CNN and Fox and the New York Times and SNL, and that this person, this buffoon, would never probably have amounted to a hill of beans if people immediately just said, no, we're not going to give you the airtime. But
yeah, well, Roger Waters pointed out there's a big difference between entertainment and real news. And so the CNN will love Donald Trump is a boon to them.
CNN's ratings must have shot through the roof.
Yeah, every day breaking news. I've seen breaking news for the last 3 years, and nothing really ever seems.
No, it's. But I had trouble with not just CNN but other news agencies during the earthquake in Haiti, and so many people lost their lives, and there was such easy reporting.
Yeah,
that you saw a lot of insensitivity and during that terrible event. And you see that a lot during terrible events. You see almost this callous disregard for what really hurts just to get a news story. Every now and then you have really, really brilliant commentary, but a lot of times it's just more sensationalism, and it's a tragic kind of relationship that the news has with this terrible moment in history.
I was hoping that you could educate me on jazz and different varieties of jazz. Is jazz born out of a cataclysm called slavery and oppression?
Absolutely. Jazz is, and it's funny because of the rhythms of jazz. So I read a book, Secular Devotion, and it talks about all the rhythms that we love, that we've adopted into Western music, rhythms that are at the basis of rock and roll and jazz and Afro-Cuban music and salsa and hip hop, and all of these rhythms can be traced to certain rhythms in West Africa that come out of a Yoruban religious practice. But I went and found even further that those rhythms were shaped and formed and influenced by performance practice that takes place in the Middle East. And if you talk to people in Spain, they will tell you, and flamenco musicians especially will tell you, that their music is born in the Middle East and in India. So it made me think about how the trail of jazz is really global. It's really global. The trail of jazz can be said to a lot of the performance practices that ended up in Western Africa come from the tip of Northern Africa and the nexus of Spain and the Middle East and India, and they make their way into Western Africa, which of course is the site of this cataclysm, this barbaric thing where we took people out of sovereign lands and put them to work without pay in horrendous conditions. And then they bring their culture and their music and their rhythms and their performance practice into all of the Americas. Because here's the thing, jazz is no more American than classical is Austrian. It's appropriation, it's cultural appropriation. It's some institution needing to sell commercialism and nationalism. By saying jazz is an American invention, we can appropriate it in the way that we've done with so many things. The invention of the telephone, the invention of the radio, I mean, all these things that other people have done, we've appropriated to some degree. Jazz was a word made up by a publicist, so, quote unquote publicist, to sell a concert series that was, in its original incantation, it was a dismissive word. But now it's become the holy writ. Jazz is America's classical music, and entire institutions are founded on this precipice of nationalism and commercialism. And it's incredible to me because jazz is actually an expression of anti-nationalism. Jazz is an expression of anti-imperialism. Jazz is an expression of the unity of global cultures coming together to overcome the voice of oppression and hatred. And in return for this incarceration, we were given these gifts of grace and love and beauty and truth. I mean, the gift that this barbaric event brought to us was the intellectual power of it. W.E.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin, the genius of a Charlie Parker. I mean, if you think about it, jazz is the gift of returning love for hatred. And you can't localize that. You can't localize that.
Say it one more time.
Jazz is the gift of returning love for hatred, as is so much of the greatness in our culture. This is not just our culture, but and it's only when we begin to embrace the idea that humanity is united that we begin to understand it.
I was reading a little bit about you, and it reminded me some of your story of a David Bowie song. And the fact that, you wanted to be a musician and you got that, and you got kind of a paying job, and you got a little bit of notoriety, and there's all this stuff, and all along the path you weren't finding happiness.
No.
And I find that very, very interesting, and I would give anything to be a paid musician, or I'd love to be a great guitar player and all that. I ended up being a history professor there.
Who, by the way, as I told you, my history professor was the greatest influence in my life.
Yeah.
Not my piano teacher, who I loved, not my jazz professors, or the people that gave me a license to play. The person that really gave me wings to fly was my American history professor in my undergraduate college.
Well, maybe there's still hope for me. I've only been doing it 25 years, but I was just asking you, when did you find your happiness? Did you find your happiness?
I don't think I have found my happiness, but I found my voice artistically when I began to connect the work that I did with things I believed in. When I started writing and creating music that was born out of conviction and connection to my community and my struggle, and the connection of struggle to people that maybe not necessarily my community, but just the idea that you could create out of conviction, and that was to me the purest art that I could come up with. It doesn't always make me popular. In fact, it sometimes works against my career. But I think connecting your convictions to your craft, to your art, is honest, and it's journalism at its best. It's truth telling, and it is when I began to feel a sense of completion. I don't believe in happiness. I don't know what that is. My mother used to say, "Mijito, are you happy?" And I'd look at her and I'd say, "I'm okay, Mom." I don't know that there's a thing called happiness. There's a famous book called The Myth of Happiness, which I think is very interesting. The myth of happiness is that it's a state, that it's a thing that happens when you get the right job or the right marriage or you get kids or this or that. And it doesn't work like that.
Yeah. It's a funny thing that I do so many interviews, and it's like if you ever traveled someplace and you're starting to get the feel, the vibe of the place, and right when you understand where you are, the vacation's over, and it's time to go. But shit, I'm just starting to understand, And I was very tantalized by your work, but I think the piano, the Latin, Afro-Latin jazz, lots of things, but your connection to humanity. And I do a lot of piece work. I connect people all over. And what I try to do very quickly, because a lot of times things are superficial, and I try to say, "What's this guy?" I said, first of all, I think you're outspoken, which I really like. I love the way that you were talking about jazz, and you were kind of telling to the students, don't worry about the damn chords, and don't worry about the scales, and don't worry about mimicking, and don't regurgitate this stuff. Just play your soul and make the loudest, most obnoxious noise that you can make, like the first time around. But my feeling, and it's probably, I see you as like a fairly jolly, upbeat kind of person, a very dynamic personality, obviously incorporating all these different, sounds and players and things like that.
Yeah, well, I'm an eternal optimist. I'm one of those people who just, I understand that things are hard and difficult, and that people want to bring suffering onto themselves. But I don't believe that is our eventual reality. Our eventual reality is that we get past ourselves. I mean, at least I have to hope so, because I'm trying desperately every single day of my life to turn down the me knob. I wake up in the morning and I have two knobs. One is me and one is others. And I try to turn down the me one and turn up the other one. Hope that that is something that is contagious, because we live. There's a lovely film by a British cartoon British cartoon. I don't remember his name. It's just gone. But it's a cartoon where everybody's looking at their lives through these little screens. And everybody's walking through their lives in this me moment, in the I generation, iPhone, I, me, my, me, my, me, I, me. And it's really happening. It's literally happening. We're watching it take place. We're watching everything be reduced down to two little, fields. Mm-hmm. And I think it's frightening. I really think it's incredibly frightening. And so I'm an optimist. I think that people will... here's what I really think. I think that we will have to gather around something other than the water cooler, because there's no more work. There's no more offices. We'll have to gather around something other than... We'll have to gather around culture and sports, because you can literally do your job. You can literally live your entire life in a little screen.
It's funny that you mentioned, because on the way over here, I was listening to NPR, and someone said the water cooler days are over.
Yeah.
Said you used to watch a great show, or you used to watch sporting. You couldn't wait. You watch Sunday Night Football. Monday, you all gathered.
And you all Monday
now
quarterbacks.
Now the stuff is instantaneous, so people are in their little communities, doing this. But I feel that the, like the phone and stuff like that is so detrimental to me, trying to be an educator.
Yeah.
I'll get somebody like trying to figure out 4 times 2 and whip out the cell phone to figure out what 4 times 2 is.
Yeah.
Or I'm not an artist, but I'd love to have a picture where everybody's looking like lemmings at their phone to go right over the cliff.
I wish I could remember this.
You just over the cliff. You can take in the middle of a day at school and take a photo and watch 1,000 students looking at their cell phone. Like the world is passing them by.
Yeah.
But they just kind of go from cell phone to moment is on the.
But that's almost why I'm an optimist, because I think that that's going to be ultimately a very, very meaningless experience. And people are, it's almost like the moment of the greatest moment in television history was decentralization of television power from 5 networks to thousands, right? So in other words, the at one point the centralization of power in this little screen is going to lead to the people being extremely dissatisfied with what it provides, I think.
And will be a catalyst for new things?
It'll be a catalyst for new things. People will go, I can't deal with this anymore. It's beginning to happen, I think. I can't deal with this little screen anymore defining my life. I think people are it may not happen today, it may not happen tomorrow, but I think people are going, I got to get out. I got to get out. I got to get physical. I got to get moving. I got to get responsive to other human beings. And I've seen it happen. It's beginning to happen. I hope it happens. I'm an optimist.
Talk to me about Ramarley Graham. You said that was a big impact on your life.
That was, Ramarley Graham was a young man, the same age as my youngest son, when he was murdered by the New York Police Department. By an officer named Richard Haste, who observed Ramarley, who he thought Ramarley had stuffed something down his sweatpants and assumed it was a weapon or guns. And then without real just cause or a search warrant, they followed him down the street, and without a search warrant, they burst into his grandmother's house where he was gunned down in front of his grandmother and his brother. The officer was never charged with murder. I think he was acquitted and he was fired, but I don't know that, so I'm going to putting myself in danger by saying that. But he was never charged with murder, capital murder, which he should have been. And there's a horrifying moment in some security video where the cops are coming out of Ramarley's grandmother's house, and the officer in question is laughing. He just ended the young man's life, and he's laughing. He's like, it's another day at the work. It's another day at the job. And for some reason, this impacted me so profoundly. Like, I just saw the idea that, and this was in the Bronx. It could have been Brooklyn. It could have been my kid. And it just saw this as, of course, in hindsight, it only hurts when it's your people, but I should have known that this is a terrible moment for me, because it hit home. It hit home that New York is not safe from this kind of irresponsible policing. And by the way, I'm not anti-police. This police have saved my son's finger. One day they were running around the house, and my older one slammed the door into my younger one's hand, and the finger was hanging by a thread. And the police came, and they were heroes. They got him to Bellevue, where they reattached his finger. Forget it. Police officers can be heroes, but irresponsible policing has to be called out for what it is. These people have guns. It's not cool. They can do way more damage with their bad decisions than you can do with your malintentions.
Right.
And I think that moment was so powerful to me, because it compelled me to really take what I did as very serious work. I realized we have to speak out against these things. I began to get I got involved with Occupy Wall Street, and I got involved with political and social causes. I began speaking out. I sought out Dr. Cornel West, and I began to appear at anti-police brutality rallies, and began to really find my feet as some form of, and I say this with a lot of self-deprecation, a safe revolutionary. You know, even though I put myself sometimes out on the line and I get into trouble, we're not at the stage where we're throwing garbage cans through bank windows, right? And I believe that if that happened, I would be on the front line. I really do believe that. But I think that it was just such a tragic death to me. Such a tragic death. A young man, life cut short for absolutely no reason and no justification. And of course, this happens all the time in the United States. And people would like to ascribe it only to racial and socioeconomic lines, but it has to do with irresponsible policing. You take these young guys, they come off the war, and they come off the Middle East occupation, and they're used to being told that these folks are going to harm you, and then they come back to the States and they take up policing jobs, and so they look at everybody in their neighborhood, everybody in their patrol with suspicion because they're taught to fear black and brown people. There's nothing to do with race. It has to do with training and irresponsible policing. And then there's a beautiful book by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow. Michelle Alexander, I think is her name. And she talks about how the proliferation of SWAT-style policing and equipment in small-town America has become the norm. So it's easy to see why incredibly bad mistakes are made by, policing methodology, and unfortunately, to me it's almost more of a socioeconomic equation, and because you police these neighborhoods that are on the fringe, and so many fringe neighborhoods are people of black and brown skin, that it really becomes a racial divide. It's a terrible thing, but I think a lot of it has to do with really, really bad training.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to kind of shift gears a little bit to Cuba,
sure,
if that's okay.
No,
with
that's
you.
okay.
And there's several things that resonated that you said with me, and talk about how the Cuban embargo hurt an already severely impoverished country.
We just enacted a law. The Trump administration has rolled back on Obama guidelines for people-to-people exchange, and we are now officially limiting the amount of money that Cuban Americans can send to their families in Cuba. I think it's down to $1,000 every 3 months. We've just rolled back on the availability of commercial flights to Cuba, which is now only Havana can be served. And I can see that the Obama administration was such an embarrassment to the Trump administration that they're going to further roll back on Cuban people-to-people. That's already been remarkable backtracking on the beautiful work that the Obama administration did regarding Cuba. Here's the problem as that I see it. The problem is that we will do business with China. China has a horrendous track record of human rights. China has an incredible oppression of the press and of free speech. China has the highest concentration of billionaires and rampant capitalism that you could ever hope to find anywhere on the planet. We'll do business with Russia. Russia has taken over sovereign land in other nations, has shot down civilian airlines, has meddled in the sovereign politics of other nations, has openly murdered an operative in London. We'll do business with Saudi Arabia.
$100 billion arms deals with them, no problem.
Right, and we'll do business with a country that summarily executed a journalist. We'll do business with some of the worst violators of human rights that you can imagine in history, but we won't do business. Not only will we not do business with Cuba, we'll affect the very basic economy of Cuba, and the reason they give is because of the human rights violations and the oppression of the press. I've been to Cuba. I go to Cuba 4 or 5 times a year.
2002 was your first trip, correct?
My first trip. And let me tell you something. When it comes to human rights violations, America has something to answer for Russell Schultz for political imprisonment. When it comes to, you can sit in a park in Cuba and get Wi-Fi and Google anything you want. You can't do that in China. When it comes to free press, you and I both know that press is expensive and there is no freedom in it, really. It's controlled by a very rigid and, some say, political ideology that helps to shape American polarization. I don't know, whatever it is, that you have the ability to say a lot more in Cuba than they'll let you think. I also find it fascinating that the blockade affects the ability of other countries to do business in Cuba. Our blockade doesn't just affect it affects the relationship we have with lots of their European partners. So here's a country that is suffering tremendous shortages. I was there 2 weeks ago. They're suffering such a severe gas shortage that policemen are stopping random vehicles in the streets and making them take other passengers. There's such a severe food shortage. They have because of the breakdown of the system in Venezuela and Brazil, because of the horrendous dictator that has taken over Brazilian politics. They have been affected by food shortages, the likes of which you wouldn't believe: eggs, chicken, milk, medicine. Forget about these things. Medicine. They are lacking in medicines that we take for granted that keep us alive, but they are not allowed to purchase because of the blockade. So what are we doing? We are hurting a people that are already poor, already suffering, for an ideological battle that doesn't exist, that didn't exist, that hasn't existed for 65 years, because they're sovereign people. They won. They won. They've retained their sovereignty and they've retained their ideology. They're not going back. They're not changing. So we're fighting this imaginary battle by already hurting people. What kind of civilized nation would do that? Mm-hmm. What kind of civilized nation would go to an already hurting people and hurt them further? What is that about? When we overlook the incredible damage that other nations do. Why? Because we can't make a profit in Cuba. At the end of the day, it comes down to what we can do and cannot do. The Cuban government will not let us take back lands that belong to Texaco, or that ostensibly belong. Because when Fidel Castro took power, he repatriated lands that were given to Exxon, to Dole, and he kept his promise. He told his people he'd liberate those lands and give them back. Well, the corporate entities in the United States didn't like that. And so, of course, we are going to hurt people because we can't profit off them. What kind of people are we?
We did the same thing in Guatemala in 1954, overthrowing a democratically elected government for the same, united front.
We have a history. In fact, it's so funny. What's hypocritical to me about the Russia outrage is that we've been systematically messing with sovereign nations' politics and elections for decades. It's we are the enemy that we purport to hate. Mm-hmm. It's the height of hypocrisy. Yeah, but I want to say one thing before we go any further. I don't hate the United States. I love the United States. I love my people. I love my block. I love my neighbors. I love the good people of the United States. People understand that the global implications of contemporary times are necessary for survival. If we're to roll back the clock on climate change, if we're to make sense of the incoming and impending doom that we've created for ourselves, it will have to be a global solution. So there are people in the United States who understand our part as part of the world. What I have a problem with is people who see isolationism as the only possible response they have to this encroachment on their racial, theological, political, and ideological lines. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. It's like saying, I'm going to stay in my apartment and I'm going to hate everybody on my building because I don't understand them. They have funny smells coming out of their kitchen and they're trying to steal from me. It makes no sense. Go to the party in your neighbor's house, embrace them, just go eat their food, hang out, sit on the stoop, for God's sake, and enjoy the view. Because the more we sequester ourselves in our hatred and our division, the less we are. That doesn't mean that you hate your apartment. Doesn't mean you hate your building. Doesn't mean that I love the United States. I understand why people come here. Mm-hmm. I do. I'm not anti-American. I'm just anti. And in fact, the most American thing a human being can do is question the path that we're going down. Mm-hmm. That is supposedly the guarantee of the United States Constitution.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things that I picked up in a lot of interviews that I watched of you, a lot of video, music, that you are often talking about conversation, and you kind of go back to Gillespie and others and the American, and you talk about this conversation that is evolving. I got very interested when you talked about Cuban musicians and Cuban jazz musicians and what they brought to the table. What was the original conversation when you talk about Gillespie and sitting in bar in Cuba. What was the dialogue about to begin with, and what is that continuing conversation?
That's a really, really loaded question because it has to do with accessing the real source of our music, acknowledging, and I'm talking strictly as a musician. When you look at this music that I love, I mean, I fell in love. I became somewhat human when I discovered Herbie Hancock's piano playing on Seven Steps to Heaven. All of a sudden, my music became not just a way to set myself apart from others in an elitist way, but I had to learn how to play like Herbie. If I didn't learn how to play like Herbie, I wasn't going to be able to live. I knew that at the age of 12.
Right?
Yeah. At the age of 12, I discovered Herbie Hancock, and I said, this is the music that will set my soul free, that will give me everything I need to be an artist. Herbie, quiet as it's kept, and all great jazz musicians are truth tellers, and their rhythmic code comes directly from Africa. And in order to really understand that conversation, Dizzy said, I need to go back to the source. And so he found in the person of Chano Pozo a direct pipeline to the Afro-Cuban rhythms, the Yoruban rhythms, the West African rhythms. Randy Western went a step further. Randy Western went and moved to Africa. I mean, to feel the need to protect one's cultural stamp by denying its roots because of its difference is, to me, it seems so crazy. And so the conversation is about acknowledging that the music we call our own is something that was a gift from another people, another time. And the best way we can develop that gift is by conversing, by exchanging information with our roots and with our future, by exchanging information. In fact, the thing that's really interesting to me about jazz is that it's found its greatest flowering in other places. The greatest jazz fans in the world are Japanese and European. We can't sustain a career in jazz unless it's institutionalized and codified and doylified and put a plastic vinyl cover on it. Deodorized, monopolized, sanitized, commodified. That's the only way we can find to make jazz relevant here. But in other places, they love it. They love that music. They just love that music, and they are clear about why they love it. It remains a part of the code of returning love for hatred, overcoming oppression through liberation. They understand that. Why don't we? Because we are so hell-bent on saying, this is an American invention. This is an American classical art form. And it just doesn't make any sense to me. So the conversation is about sitting down at the table and looking at your relatives and saying, oh, this is what I am. This is how I go forward. Conversation is about admitting that there are other agents in your life besides the ones that you're comfortable with, besides the ones that you can control and the ones that you can co-opt. That's a scary thing. That's a really scary thing for most people. Most people would rather not know their relatives.
Is that why it's such a loaded question that I gave you there? I mean, is this like, are you arguing, does it take away from something from America? Is it saying, hey, we've got roots and you
on the
need
contrary,
to acknowledge?
in the contrary, it is when giants like Dizzy Gillespie embrace these roots that they become harbingers, avatars of a much bigger reality for jazz.
Mm-hmm.
So on the contrary, by acknowledging the background, the diversity, and the future of this music, we actually affirm our identity as jazz musicians. So to me, it's ludicrous to think that you can affirm yourself by denying others,
Yes.
or denying the past. It's just a ludicrous lie. The way I affirm myself is by experiencing other people, by opening myself up to danger, to dangerous connections, dangerous voyages, dangerous interactions, dangerous realities. Going in the subway in Seoul without knowing where I'm going.
Yeah. In peace work, we call that dangerous conversations.
Yeah.
You know, you have to say things that might be very, very difficult to do that. But you put an album together talking about the conversation, right? It was 6 musicians that you put together. So
that had to do with a very specific conversation. That was the conversation. And the conversation between Cuba, Afro-Cuban and jazz is very simple. Afro-Cuban musicians look at jazz musicians and put them on a pedestal. I mean, Afro-Cuban musicians do that to jazz musicians. Sorry. Jazz musicians look at Afro-Cuban music and go, oh, how exotic, how like otherworldly it is. And it's really inappropriate to me because the roots of jazz are in Afro-Cuban music and are in African music and African rhythmic code. Neither side can really understand itself without the other side. We cannot venerate jazz any more than jazz can see us as exotic. That is very destructive to the future of this music. Because in order to really move this music forward, as some very wonderful musicians are doing, they are modernizing. They are attempting to understand in the context of globalization, in the context of the modern world, the African rhythmic code and its predecessors. And they are no longer, and the corollary is true. The vice is true that musicians from those worlds are not looking at jazz as the ultimate solution of their rhythmic code and their, it's. I mean, I think young musicians get it. A really great young musician, pianists like David Varela, or people that have a totally different approach to this whole Cuban jazz mystery, are understanding it. They're not playing montunos and they're not playing bebop. They're finding that third solution that says we acknowledge bebop, we acknowledge Afro-Cuban montunos, but that leads somewhere. We're not staying in that world. Mm-hmm. That's the conversation I'm interested in. The conversation I'm interested in is the one that includes all of the Americas. The conversation I'm interested in is the one that says, what about the music of Peru? What about the music of Colombia? What about the music of Bolivia? How does that play into the music of jazz? How does that play into the music of Afro folkloric practice?
Yeah. Is it not true that you reworked one of your dad's classics by having all the people from the places you're talking about from the Americas?
I took one of my,
reimagined maybe as a.
I took one of my father's. I came from an institution that was built on replication. So the art of jazz and the canonization of jazz was kind of my model, and I bought that. I bought that in every way. I bought that line, hook and sinker, and so I began to veer away from that. And at some point, I realized one of the things that my father did was write the Afro-Cuban Jazz Suite with Charlie Parker, which was truly revolutionary in the history of this music because it was the first multi-movement suite written by an Afro-Cuban musician with hints of contemporary classical avant-garde writing with real jazz and a virtuosic solo. So just so many firsts in that piece that it's literally required listening in conservatories throughout the world. And I thought, well, I can play that piece, or I can play a piece like it, or I can replicate a piece like that. But what I really want to do is I want to pay tribute to a 26-year-old young man who, given the opportunity, decided to challenge everything. And that spirit for progress and that spirit for vision is interesting to me as the notes that produced from it. And so my father's courage and his vision and his intelligence and his daringness was something that I think we've lost sometimes in jazz. We've lost that in jazz. And so instead of writing something like it, I wanted to write in the spirit of it. And so I wrote a piece that took some of those same elements that my father was working with and dealt with them in contemporary times. For instance, the idea of Cuban jazz being the state of the art, it's not anymore. The state of the art is Pan-American. We now actually have music from Colombia, from Peru. We have festejo, we have cumbia, we have all kinds of different rhythms that are now part of the language of jazz. So let's appropriate them into that conversation. We have a soloist on the level of a Charlie Parker in the person of Rudresh Mahantap of Asian origin. Of South Asian origin. We have so many things that are happening now that I wanted to bring into the conversation, like my father brought into the conversation when he wrote the Afro-Cuban Jazz Suite, that I thought it was really high time to deal with the spirit that drives progress and not replication of a lost era.
So in 2002, you had gone to make your album, and I believe you were there only about a day, and some momentous news came out about Obama and speaking about the embargo. and that just must have been so surreal being in Cuba and in hearing this. And I wrote that there. You heard some momentous news from President Obama. What was it, and how did you react?
Well, actually, the first time that I heard it was from President Castro, because we'd heard that actually, and there was portents of it. There was hints and we'd been hearing for months that something was brewing, and then we were at the home of the head of the American Interest section there. He used to throw a party for us every year for the jazz festival, and we were able to get a private audience with him, and so he looked very, 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 very distracted, and there was something about him that was very, very. He was on edge, and we said, "What's going on?" He kind of looked at us very seriously and said, "I can't say anything." And then the next day we were rehearsing, and there was, a hubbub, and the people were going downstairs to the community room of the synagogue that we were rehearsing at, and there was a bunch of Cuban citizens watching the television. I have it on my iPhone, and the president of the Republic of Cuba was announcing that an era of alienation was coming to an end, and the president of the United States soon came on and also said that. And I love a lot of things Obama is wonderful for, whether you agree with all his policies and whether you understand the historicity of his administration and what he was attempting to do. The secondary to the idea that Obama understood how to talk to people from a base of truth. And he looked into the camera and said, there has been a mistake. I mean, I'm not going to paraphrase, but he said, we've had a mistake in policy.
Since 1960.
And it's amazing to me when a personal friend can say, I've made a mistake. It's amazing when a partner can look at you and go, I've made a mistake. It's amazing to me that the president of the United States looked into a camera and said, we've been making a mistake for 60 plus years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's time to put that era to an end.
Yeah.
That was so powerful to me. And I happen to, there are a lot of moments in Obama's oratorical history. That wasn't a particularly emotional one, but it was a really powerful one for me, for a sitting president to look into a camera and go, we have made a mistake. Rightly so, the Cuban people were wary of it. They were not buying it. Cuban people have had a dubious relationship with the United States, and there was amongst that group of people in that room downstairs, in the community room, in the synagogue, there were kind of disinterested looking folks who were just kind of going, The feeling I got was the collective vibe in the room was, I'll see it, I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah.
We saw people, more Americans than Cubans, who were really celebratory.
Yeah.
I personally was profoundly affected because I thought about my father, who would have wept at the idea of his people actually reuniting with the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah,
and for a minute it looked like we were working towards the dismantling of the greatest political charade of all time, the blockade. Here we are, and we're back. Back.
You also, before you go on there, you were very upset and thought about the impoverished people of Cuba.
It's hard to believe how, I don't think people understand what it's like not to be able to get life-saving medicine. I don't think people understand quite what it's like to have your life hang in the balance because you can't get a medication 90 miles to the north that is freely available to people. People literally die of high blood pressure. Mm-hmm. And here we just take a drug every day. Mm-hmm. It's kind of hard to believe. It's kind of hard for me to, so forget about the obvious ones like starvation or getting paid $10, $15 a month for driving a cab when you're a doctor, when you're a brain surgeon. Forget about all that stuff. Just survival.
Mm-hmm. You once said that Cuba is a place that makes out of nothing miracles.
Yeah. I was saying to my friends in Cuba last week, I said, you guys know how to invent joy out of water. They do. They literally invent joy out of water. They fix their cars with Band-Aids, spit, and safety pins.
Like MacGyver.
Yeah, they're like, these people are indefatigable. They're indomitable. These people are, quite frankly, here's the real thing about Cuba. I believe the greatest threat they pose to the United States is the one where they reveal the mediocrity of thinking that material goods will save your soul and make you a happy nation. What they do every day with the little they have is nothing short of miraculous. They're some of the most joyful, proud people I've ever seen. And I've been all over the world 15 times. And they do so just based on their sense of community, their sense of self, and their sense of sovereignty. Now imagine that. Their sense of themselves is so powerful. And of course, now, 60 years into the revolution, they all have a guaranteed education, they all have a guaranteed sense of themselves that they did not have before. And this is really the issue. The sovereignty they have is a large source of their strength. You're not going to take that away.
Mm-hmm.
Not now, not ever.
Well, I tell my students, you think about the United States going to Afghanistan, you see all the Russian tanks on the side of the road. That should have given you some pause.
Absolutely.
But Alexander the Great, hundreds of years before Jesus was born, tried to do the same thing. You're never going to take that away.
No.
You're never going to take the...
No, and it makes sense. It makes sense. It's like a room of one's own.
Yeah.
You know, except on a bigger and on a more national level.
Yeah. Just a couple of things here, and then I'll look over my notes, and then I'll set you free. And I'm deeply...
No, I'm grateful to be able to speak.
I'm deeply appreciative. I really am. I think when I was talking to Roger, he wasn't much for civilities. I kind of told him what he meant to me, and my feelings. I think we're going to go out there and say,
I consider myself, I think one of the greatest things anyone has ever said to me is not, oh man, your writing is so cool or your playing is so amazing. Among the greatest things that people say to me is you speak for a lot of people that don't feel they have a voice. That's really powerful to me.
Yeah.
That as a jazz musician, anyone would listen to me is incredible.
Yeah.
But I mean, to be able to say things to cameras and to audiences that other people think but don't have the platform to say, that's the biggest privilege that a human being can have.
Yeah. Well, I said this to Jim. Jim's followed me. We've been in a lot of places in the world, and visually say that sometimes you walk out of an interview and it's warm and fuzzy. I mean, I'm really lucky of the people that I've actually met. But I always have something in mind, and it's never monetary. But if there's a lesson, if you can use music to transcend borders, and people can really appreciate that. I was in El Paso, and I always listen to NPR News, and I heard about this doctor, Dr. Carlos Gutierrez, and heard that on Friday afternoon he had a half day, that he'd go to all these different shelters, and he would give all the medical attention that he could, and he'd have to take the ones that are very sick. He just couldn't reach the hundreds out there.
Right.
So Jim and I were there. On the day we were there, 1,000 refugees were let loose by ICE, and they go to all these different shelters. We saw kids from Honduras and Guatemala and all that. And this one hotel was dedicated to them. I mean, everybody on there was a refugee, and all the kids were eating pizza, and I was teasing them. And I said, I'm going to take your pizza. I was just teasing with them. And to shadow this person and show what these refugees had been through, how many miles they had traveled.
See, in a way, I'm sorry to interrupt, but in a way, that's a uniquely American thing to be able to do. That's uniquely American, to be able to come to this nation, make of yourself a great doctor, and then return to your people. I mean, that's some of the spirit of America that I recognize.
Yeah.
That's some of what makes America great, to remember from whence you came and to turn and give back. That's really something that makes me proud.
Well, one of the things that I'm trying to do in the documentary is focus on the humanity. I interviewed a guy, Jim Gilchrist, who was a guy as a border militia, and I went and I interviewed him, and it was pretty easy interview.
Like independent militia?
Yeah,
like
just like border militia, like all that. But I always
scary.
get in a documentary, like I think you need to expose people like that. And I said, Jim, do you know what we did in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador?
Right.
And he really came clean. He said, John, I really don't. And I said, well, you might want to look at that. And there's this guy, I just love him to death, it's Sheriff Tony Estrada. He was born in Nogales, Mexico.
Right.
And he's been a sheriff for 50 years, the most humane man ever. And one of these facts, I say it in every interview that I do, but it just resonates with me, that we have 5% of the world's population in America. That's it, 5%.
Right.
And we do 50% of the world's drugs.
Right.
Who creates the drug cartels in Mexico and other places?
Of course.
You look at all of our policies, like you gave the policy, what do we do in Cuba? What do we do in these other countries? How did the United States create ISIS? There's all these different policies that someone says, oh no, we're talking about all the drugs that are coming in. It's like, well,
what about all the guns that make their way south of the border?
Yeah,
it's all profit driven,
and the money and all the profit and all that other kind of stuff.
It's all profit driven.
Yeah, that people aren't paying attention. So those things that we talk about that are very significant.
That's the problem with this moment in history, is people are manipulating racial divide, and the real color of divide is green. The real color of divide is monetary and income inequality.
Well, I laugh about this. You fly a lot. You've been all over the world, right? Yeah. You go on a plane and it says occupied, all right? So you go back to your seat, someone's in there, you go back 10 minutes later, still occupied. Go back 10 minutes, someone's having a problem in there, they've been occupied. Can you imagine being occupied for more than 50 years and say, oh, well, the Palestinians are occupied? And one of the things that I saw, and I found this very interesting, because you talk about, that you're outspoken and you feel on duty. I asked Roger Waters, who just turned 64, and I'm sitting, as I said, in the Hamptons, and I said, Roger, God, this is beautiful. We're sitting on your patio. You're 64 years of age, millions of dollars. I said, well, why do you do it? Why do you get, political? You're labeled an anti-Semite. We're talking about Zionism. He said he could have made millions more if he had not been political. And he talked a little bit about his mom and his dad. He never knew his dad. And it's a powerful. And why are you, active, or why are you an activist? He said, that he really has to do it. And I know that you are very, can be outspoken. And one of the things I wanted to ask, does your music express your politics? Or does your politics express your music, or combination thereof?
I'm one of those people who does not. I've had this conversation with many composers, many great composers, and there are composers who feel that your music should be abstract and free of narrative, that it should strictly be an aesthetic construct. And I'm one of those people who I don't know how to do that. I wish I had the talent. I wish I had the talent to just make beautiful sounds or interesting sounds, but I don't. My composition, my work, my pianist, my skill as a pianist comes from having to relate to me, to my life, to the struggles of my children and my people, and everything has to have a basis in my life. So I don't know how to separate my politics from my music. I don't know how to separate my music from my politics.
Has that cost you?
I have definitely been not recognized in bastions of jazz accreditation.
Because of your
and yet I've been embraced by places that are embracing of all music. So there are some jazz institutions that will go out of their way to ignore me, and there's some that will embrace me. Yeah. The ones that understand that jazz is a reflection of the universality of overcoming oppression, those are the ones that will embrace me. The ones that sell the commercial and national version of this music, which, by the way, is the wrong version.
Yeah.
This music is, to me, this music is almost God's voice of saying, we are not limited. I mean, and I don't mean that in a religious way. I mean that we are not limited. The voice of oppression is not the stronger voice. The voice of salvation and liberation. And I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about the voice of overcoming hatred with love is the much stronger force. And in the end, again, I'm a cockeyed optimist. In the end, I think that's what we'll see.
I just thought of a question that maybe you can help me with. As a kid, I really loved Pink Floyd. the couple. I was always into English bands, not American bands growing up.
I was a real prog, by the way.
Well,
A little known fact, I was a real prog rock person. I love Genesis. I love Yes.
Yeah.
I love Pink Floyd. I love King Crimson.
Oh yeah, they just
that's my Emerson, Lake and Palmer. That's my thing.
I was big into that. I think Queen was a big band for me. Bowie was very big for me. The Who, certainly for me. But one of the things I was trying to get Roger, I was trying to get at the crux of the conflict that he had with David Gilmour. And sometimes, like, when you just see, to me, something that's magical, I've listened to some of your stuff and I'm just, God, I'm getting into the drums and getting into the piano and getting into the rhythms, and it's like a novice here, and I'm just like listening to that. And I said to Roger, I said, man, God, I love Pink Floyd. Richard Wright was great on keyboards, and everybody does this. And it's almost like there's an emphasis that, Roger wrote the words, and Roger was very thematic. And when Syd Barrett was just fried his brain, that all of a sudden it's like sink or swim, he said. It's like somebody has to start, writing. But the emphasis was, some of the conflict was, that Roger does the writing and he comes up with the themes and does that. And then, oh my God, if you love the guitar, David Gilmour's, and you're listening to the guitar. And I guess what I'm trying to ask is where the egos come in, and can people come out and say, holy shit, what we produce, like in a marriage, is phenomenal.
Well, you have to remember that my entry point into my consciousness was Herbie Hancock playing on 7 Steps to Heaven and Miles Davis. I didn't know about the African American civil rights struggle. I didn't know about anything. I didn't understand a darn thing. But the aesthetic and the level of sophistication, I didn't understand then that it came from African rhythmic code, that it came from understanding jazz, that it came from understanding this history of our music. All I knew was that it was aesthetically the most pleasing thing that I ever heard in my life. And I said, that's what I need to do. I think that is best realized when I marry my convictions to my art. I think my expression of my highest artistic self and what I do is only possible when I really care about every note I play and when I really care about every note I write. And so I'll sit there and write and compose based on deep thought, and that's when it comes to life. And so at this point in my life, I don't know what may happen from here on in, but at this point in my life, and my beliefs and my convictions are irrevocably intertwined with every the abstract note that I create.
Yeah. Well, I think for Roger, if he can't write and he can't come up with a theme, it isn't just, whether he plays his instrument well. For him, it's just the things are,
There's nothing worse than if you're writing and you don't feel like this is something so tawdry when you're writing and you just can't come up with that connection.
Mm-hmm. Well, he read one of the things, and I was saying he never knew his father. And I thought the interview was going a little slow. Because I think he was hungover, and then he was breathing on me with it was very heavy alcohol, and I was like, okay. But it was just because I don't think he was feeling all that well.
Right.
And then I thought, fuck it, this is my interview. And I started to pick it up, and then we started to talk about certain things, and I asked him about Sid, when he was like 17, you had the whole world ahead of you. And then I talked about his father, who was killed in World War II, and he says, hold on, I'm going to run up, and he goes upstairs and pulls down a computer, and he read the Child Left Behind.
Right.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
I listened to that, and I just watched the interview again, and I just, God, oh my God. And then he was talking about Sid and some of just a gift of putting this together.
Yeah.
Do you know where The Wall comes from?
I don't know.
No, I'm just curious. Not like that.
I just listened to it like any beautiful teenager.
He told me,
I never really thought about
what he said about The Wall was that they were playing these big arenas and they were making big money. And I know a lot of bands that I followed did not make money on tour. They were big extravaganzas costing millions of dollars. And they came up and he said, we made really good money. And he said, I think it was in Canada, but I think he was playing in Canada. And he said he saw all these kind of like English yabos, were kind of drunk and, taking drugs and weren't really in tune. he said he felt like just this whole wall went up, that he was so dislocated that there was the people paying really good money. They were there for Pink Floyd, but they weren't really paying attention to what he was doing. And he said it was so funny, like you heard another brick in the wall. He said it was so funny, like it almost evolved. I mean, he wasn't planning, he was playing a concert. And then he said, oh my God, this is the wall between me and them and what I do for a living. And little by little, I mean, and then wrote.
It's funny, I heard Tom York of Radiohead say something really similar about how he was challenged in the complacency, if you will, of Radiohead was huge, and he came out with his own project because he felt like it was just too easy in some level to placate his crowds.
I didn't, a lot of people you interview and they don't necessarily represent your ideas, but Roger Waters got into it big time with Tom.
Did he?
Oh, but overplaying Israel and some of the things I think that Roger Waters says are totally intemperate. Like he said, do you know when you play Israel that you're playing for Jewish terrorists or something like that? And they really got Roger Waters did the same with Madonna and Cyndi Lauper and Bon Jovi, and so. His attitude is that this is a racist apartheid place, and so when you go and do your art there, you're supporting this racist, regime.
It's funny because when you talk to Israeli musicians, I work with a lot of Israeli musicians, and they'll be the first ones to tell you that there's a lot of unjust, really, really, and yet, you have to. They're Israeli. They have to work within the confines of what their mommies and poppies are there.
Right.
Their tias and tios are there.
Oh, yeah.
So regardless of what they feel about Palestinian-Israeli relations, they're...
Yeah. Well, let me wind this down. And I had a couple of things that hit me. I don't know, I've had the good fortune to speak at the United Nations and win a peace award from the United States Congress. And what I really like to do globally is reach out to people all over the world. And you do something different in the sense that it's music and you reach out all over the world. Is there a possibility of having student exchange with Cuba and the United States and talking about peace and culture?
It was historic. I brought a delegation from Brooklyn College to the Institute of the Arts, the Escuela Superior de los Artes, and engineered a meeting between the president of Brooklyn College and the president of ISA. And we talked about student exchange, faculty exchange, beginning to teach contemporary music studies in Cuba, and it was a historic event. And somehow the bureaucracy of that place and the funding of these things never materialized. But my absolute dream is to have some sort of relationship with an institution like ISA, and perhaps with the institution that I'm affiliated with now. But to be able to have a true faculty and student exchange with a place like Cuba would have incredible repercussions for both of us. By the way, some of the best classical musicians I know are trained in Cuba.
Mm-hmm. I used to have a live class with New Zealand, and it was great. My students would come in at 2:00 on Mondays and Wednesdays, and the individuals would be coming at 9:00, but the next day. So my class is Monday, Wednesday, but same class with them. They come in Tuesday, Thursday, and it was just the most brilliant class. Yeah. And we've done things with Northern Ireland on peace, and I've done things with Palestinians live.
I'm dying to do stuff like that.
Have my students who knew nothing, and a lot of them just gung ho. I was telling one of the people, I said, I want to give you perspective. This Palestinian had been to the Mediterranean once in his life because he got a 12-hour pass that the Israelis gave him. I said, can you imagine? I'm in Santa Monica, that once in my life I got a pass for 12 hours to go there. This one gentleman, everybody's interrelated, they're all family in Palestine, So this guy, he takes me on this big hill above Tel Aviv. I can see the airport from the distance. We're on this big hill. I said,
I've been there.
He says, you see all that, Mr. Haas? I said, yeah. He said, my grandfather owned all of that land there.
That's right.
He said, I've never been on it. You know why? I can never go on it.
Right.
He said, but that's what my grandfather's
older
land.
The older Israelis, but the older Sabras, The older Sabras will tell you of a time when Palestinian and Israeli children played together.
Mm.
There was a time in the nation's history when there wasn't such a demarcation. So I don't want to hazard as to why it's such a, there's a lot of other factors.
I'm just trying to be, upbeat and optimistic, but the connections, I'm working with people around the world in Holland and in Asia and Northern Ireland on peace, but we're having student exchanges and
it begins
dialogue.
There. It begins there. I mean, if you bring young people, this is why I started my work in Cuba. I began my work in Cuba because I brought my sons to Cuba and stuck them in cohorts of young musicians there, and I watched and observed that the misinformation and fear and apprehension instantly melted when they started talking about mouthpieces and sharp 13 chords, and I realized that the young people don't really have any of this baggage.
Have your trips been documented? I don't mean that they haven't been written down, but like filmed.
They have. I've had film crews follow me for years, and I rarely see the full fruit of them. I did. Yeah, we had film crews come with us to Cuba, and wonderful footage taken of magic moments. But
when I shadowed the doctor, it's funny how we're all very good friends, but to go to all the places that he went to show what the migrants were going through and how thousands were let loose on that particular day. It's Friday morning at 10. 1,000 refugees are now in El Paso, and where are they going and what they're.
I think it's really funny because I think that I'm not a documentarian, but I know that seeing these things is different than hearing about them, and it's not theory anymore.
Yeah.
And seeing people,
well, I don't want to belabor this, but I teach the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I teach global studies, and one of the things that resonated, Israel always says, in the war of words, we always win. In the war of pictures, we lose. That is to say, if people could see what actually goes in the occupation, when you hear all these people saying Israel is the most humane military in the world, or Israel left Gaza in 2005, and I said, okay, sure, they did. Is that who controls the water and the airspace?
That's why I believe that art is journalism. That's why I believe that truth telling is what we are called to do, and I think that.
All right, this is my final, right? Jim and I, and I'm always looking for advice. The things we've done on the border, we've gone from San Diego, we've been in Juarez. We have a photojournalist over there that really, he really chronicled the violence in Juarez when things were very bad. We've been to Big Bend, we've been to all these places. When you think about the U.S.-Mexican border, and one of the reasons I wanted to interview is how you transcend the border with the crisis that's taking place on the border, and these different crises out there. What do you think the plan is for moving forward? I mean, do you think the continuation of the music and the arts and the transcendence?
It's funny. I point to this model of looking the part of the secret to transcending the moment is to examine the history of political and border politics. This is nothing new. We have a way of turning a deaf ear to what history has to teach us. And there was a time period when thousands of Mexicans were lynched. There was a time period when if we examine the horrors of the history of the United States and Mexico, we will start to begin to understand why we're arriving at this moment now. This is nothing new.
You look at 1821 and the land grants and the way that Mexicans were depicted at the time. It's so similar to what you would hear. I asked my students, you hear about the border? I said, when did the border come into play? And in 1918, it was a line in the sand in Nogales.
Of course.
Border.
But the thing is also, it's a symbiotic relationship. The thing that we also need to look at is, because this is what history teaches us, that it's not just the lynchings. It's also the symbiosis of commerce, the symbiosis of industry, the symbiosis of land management. Yeah. Without Mexico, quite frankly, the United States would not be the great nation that it is. And we don't see that.
Yeah. Well, the Sheriff Tony Estrada said we took our eye off a very friendly neighbor and we got involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we left the friendly neighbor, and now we're paying the price for neglecting our friendly neighbor, Mexico.
Yeah.
So we had to pay. I wanted to ask you, before you go, is there any of your music that can be used for a sizzle reel for PBS? I mean, is there some?
Of course.
Well, I mean, that stuff is all very, but I'm wondering all of your work. I mean, we want to present it to PBS, and what I'm trying to do is I have an embarrassment of riches. I believe Zarello Martinez had two musicians that the famous Mexican chef Zarello Martinez.
Of course.
And but we were looking at all the culture on the border. I had a guy by the name of Omeka. He's a hip hop guy. Oh my God, he's got some addicting. He performed at my school, and he's been interviewed by BBC and PBS on his music is influenced by the border. He's got some very addictive songs. I'm just wondering.
I have a piece that I love that we did that is called "They Came." It's from a recording called "The Offense of the Drum," and ostensibly it's about the Puerto Rican migration, the great Puerto Rican migration that took place. But it's really applicable to all of this. It's applicable to it because it has to do with how a dominant culture can rob you of self-worth and self-esteem. And I think sometimes we ourselves subject ourselves to very shoddy treatment because we lose our self-esteem in the face of the constant beating that we get emotionally, spiritually, and physically. Sure. And I think that, that piece really speaks to something that's relatively new in my life, which is I have a tremendous orgullo Latino. I'm very proud to be Latino. I'm very proud to be Latino living in the United States. Very proud of my people, very proud of what we bring every day to this nation. Great art, some of the greatest filmmakers, some of the greatest artists, some of the greatest chefs, some of the greatest people that contribute on a day-to-day basis in the United States are people of Latino extraction, and I'm very proud of that. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like that's a message that that piece portrays, and I would love that piece to be a central focus of my work.
I want to tell you that you pick up on vibes very quickly, and I appreciate your generosity with your time and not kind of rushing me and a feeling that I could get the ideas. It's funny, like when I was talking about films, the last little piece you gave me, I could see it from afar. It's perfect. This little vignette on the contributions of your people and what goes on, and that's the kind of stuff that
I'm always amazed by the penchant my people took for Hollywood filmmaking. Like, I'm always amazed by the artistry that has been contributed to by.
My daughter has a friend. She went to Claremont High School. I think the guy's won his third award for documentaries. His dad works for Fox News. I'm trying to.
But I just think it makes sense because if you look at the iconography and imagery of Latino culture, it's very stark, a lot of color, we're very visual people, and so it makes sense that we would be a big part of Hollywood,
Yeah, right. If I could get a photo with you.
Yeah, I'd be honored to.
Yeah, thank you. And then